All right, everybody. Welcome back, historians. We are going to be talking a little bit about the Eisenhower years and what was going on in the United States as pertains to the Cold War. If you remember, Dwight D. Eisenhower was one of the generals in charge during World War II. So he was a World War II hero. He was a celebrity. People knew him. You can see his campaign, I Like Ike, and there he is. World War II hero, president 1953 to 1961. So he wins twice, Republican. And so there had been a Democrat that had been president basically from 1932 when FDR defeated um, Hoover until all the way through Truman. So basically from 32 until 52, you had Democrat president, and now you're going to have a Republican for 8 years in Eisenhower. And one of the things, being a military guy, is they created what they called the New Look policy. And the idea behind this is let's have less people as part of the military. However, we're going to improve our technology. And with improving technology, whether that's guns or missiles, whatever, also improve our nuclear capabilities. So, how can we continue to make bigger and better nuclear bombs? And they continue to do that. So, the atom bomb gets replaced by the H bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which is going to be much more powerful. And of course, the Soviet Union is going to be doing the same thing. Basically, this is going to help create the arms race. Who can make the best weapons? And one of the ideas is, hey, we don't have to fight wars if they know we can use nuclear weapons. They call it massive retaliation, basically meaning, hey, we've got these big bombs, you've got those big bombs. If you try to use those big bombs on us, we're going to use all of our big bombs on you. And so don't even think about being aggressive towards us. So massive retaliation with nuclear weapons in response to any act of aggression by a potential enemy. You can see the red button. There was I always thought this was a funny Far Side cartoon when I saw it. You've got the nuclear mushroom clouds going up in the background, two guys out there fishing. Norm must ask, what's that mean? And the other guy says, I'll tell you what this means, Norm. No size restrictions and screw the limit. Basically meaning, hey, the world's going to be coming to an end. We can keep all the fish we want. Mutually assured destruction. If you kill us, we kill you. And there were a lot of movies made about this. One of the better movies of all time that's out there, I think they made it in the 60s, Dr. Strangelove and How I Fell in Love with the Atom Bomb. So if it's a comedy, but it's probably one you haven't seen, but if you're interested in this type of thing, you might like that. Brinkmanship. This is the idea of going all the way to the edge. The practice of pushing dangerous events to the brink of disaster in order to achieve the most advantageous outcome. So essentially what you're doing here is it's like playing a game with chicken. All right, some of you when you were younger probably did it on bikes. Two people are biking right at each other, and whoever pulls off right at the end loses. But you try to stay on that path for as long as possible. I think they used to do it in cars and stuff in the 50s. But you're going right to the brink. And that's what they're doing with the nuclear weapons. That's what they're doing where you've got the US and the Soviets, and neither one wants to back up. Neither one wants to back off. You're going as far as you think you possibly can. And that was called brinkmanship. You don't want to be the leader that pulls out early and gets out of there early, because then you're going to be looked at as weak. And so who can take it to the edge? As this is going on, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a group of scientists that study different man-made things, some type of organization, I believe they're in Chicago. They started it in 1947. They called it the Doomsday Clock. When the big hand would hit midnight, hit 12, that would mean the world was ending. And so they did it not just for nuclear bombs, but any type of threats to humanity, unchecked scientific and technological advances. And so one of the things is, as they deemed us getting closer to nuclear war and nuclear annihilation, they would move the big hand up there and get real close. They still have the doomsday clock today, however, and they still do take into account nuclear weapons and things like that. But they're also looking at different things: global warming, climate change, all sorts of things like that. Are we running out of fresh water? Different things. One of the things going on um, early in Eisenhower's presidency was trouble in Southeast Asia. There was a colony, a French colony called Indochina, French Indochina out here. It was populated mostly by Vietnamese people, and the Vietnamese wanted their own country, and they were rebelling. So think of this similar to our colonists back in the Revolutionary War days, only they had always been there. The Vietnamese had always been there, and they want to be free. And of course, you would think the United States, believing in democracy, would take the Vietnamese side, but no, we supported the French. One of the things we were worried about is if Vietnam does become independent from France, they might become communist. And a major battle occurs called Dien Bien Phu, the communist Vietnamese victory against the French. Basically, after this, the French have to surrender. It goes to the United Nations. The United Nations draws up a protocol, draws up a charter that breaks up North and South Vietnam into two countries, with the idea that eventually they might form into one. The North is going to be led by a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh had been this freedom fighter, kind of the George Washington of Vietnam. He wanted independence from France. And when the United States didn't help him, he went to the next best option, the Soviet Union, who said, yeah, we'll support you. Ho Chi Minh didn't care whether they were going to be capitalists, communist, anything like that. He wanted them to be free. Well, who's going to support him? The Soviet Union. And so he says, yeah, we'll become communist if we gain our freedom. And so the North, led by Ho Chi Minh, becomes communist. The South is going to be helped by the United States and some other groups, and they are going to become capitalistic, although kind of ran by a dictator who was pretty cruel. And here was the leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, and you can see Ngo Dinh Diem shaking hands with Eisenhower here. This is going to lead to the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Atlantic Treaty Organization. Or sorry, that's wrong. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So Southeast Asia, no Atlantic Ocean over here. And what's forming are countries like Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, which were going to gain their freedom from the United States after World War II. You've got Pakistan involved here, France, of course, that had French Indochina, Great Britain, all going to be part of this organization. Thailand. The theory that Eisenhower had was that if Vietnam were to fall to communism, all the other countries in the area would also become communist. They called that the domino theory. So if one country fell, it would be like a domino stacked up, they would all fall. And so the idea was to keep Vietnam from becoming communist. Now, early on in the 50s, we simply provided money and aid to different groups. First the French, and then others. It isn't until over 10 years later in the 1960s that we actually start sending tens of thousands of troops there. And that's going to be one of our next units is the Vietnam War. Another big thing that happens in 1956 is one of the Warsaw Pact countries revolts. The people are saying, hey, we do not want to be communist anymore. We don't like it. This is not for us. And so it was the people of Hungary start to have a revolution against the communist government of Hungary. And the communist government of Hungary was going to fail. It was going to collapse and a new government was going to take over. Now, Hungary is very close to the Soviet Union, Soviet Union doesn't need a democracy that close to them that would be an ally to Western Europe and the United States. So the Soviet Union decides to send in troops and tanks to help the communist Hungarians. And when they do that, that basically puts an end to the revolt. Now, the United States is supposed to, be helping these countries out if they can, but basically Eisenhower says, ooh, if we sent troops in there, that could start a real war with the Soviet Union. We don't want that. Even though Hungary was asking for help. You can see it touches the Soviet Union right here. They're asking the US and Western Europe for help. It doesn't come because nobody wants a war. And it's not like communism was spreading, it was already there. You can see the political cartoon here. Hungary, kind of a dead guy there. Looks like blood dripping off the hands. This is the dictator, the new dictator of Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Man of the Year, the Hungarian freedom fighter. And they were not successful. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but you'll hear this was another issue with the Soviet Union, and Egypt at the time had been controlled for years by France and Great Britain, and the French in the 1800s had dug the Suez Canal, which was very important in getting supplies from Asia to the Americas and to Europe. Things like oil coming from Saudi Arabia. You don't want to have to sail all around Africa. The Egyptians decided to nationalize it and take control of the Suez Canal. The French, the British, and Israel don't like that, and they decide to try to take it back. And a war starts. The United States is not involved in the fighting. And basically, the Soviet Union threatens to help Egypt and use nuclear weapons. And the United States basically tells France and Great Britain and Israel to back down. So this was another case of people threatening each other with nuclear weapons. And we'll have a little video on that later. Why is the Suez Canal so important? Well, if you're getting stuff from here, you can take the shortcut through the Mediterranean. If they close the Suez Canal, now you have to sail all around Africa. That's going to take a lot longer and cost a lot more money. So the Suez Canal is very important. Eisenhower signs a doctrine similar to the Truman Doctrine. Remember the Truman Doctrine, the goal was to stop the spread of communism. The Eisenhower Doctrine says the U.S. will provide military and economic assistance to Middle Eastern countries in resisting communist insurgents. The country of Israel was created in 1948, and we've always supported Israel, and one of the reasons is they're a democracy in a region in the world that didn't have a lot of democracies. So you think, boy, you hear about all these problems in the Middle East. When did we first really start getting involved there? In the 1950s, and some of it was to stop the spread of communism there, and some of it's to keep buying lots of oil. Eisenhower focused on the CIA and building that up. The CIA was new at this point. It was less expensive and easier to keep a secret. The CIA was going to be doing the Central Intelligence Agency. They're the ones across the ocean. They're the ones gathering information on other countries. They've got spies. And so the CIA is created and is out there, and Eisenhower helps build it up, and they're out there gathering information. And they're going to be helping with some overthrows of different leaders and things like that we'll hear more about as we learn about the Cold War. Thousands of CIA operatives were assigned to countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, in the Middle East. The idea many times was to keep leaders in charge of these countries that we wanted, so they could help overthrow a leader by launching a coup or helping launch a coup, training people, training soldiers. They could help with the assassination of leaders in countries that we didn't like, to make sure we got a leader in there that we did like. We were going to arm anti-communist revolutionaries, which we do, especially in places like Nicaragua, some other things over the years. Help spread propaganda. This was the leader of the Shah in Iran that we helped put in charge. And so we'll talk about this, but it does probably is a band-aid short term back in those days to get things the way we want, but over the long term, it caused a lot of issues for us and still is. This was a big deal, 1957. The Soviets launched Sputnik into space. Sputnik was a satellite that floated around the Earth. People could actually pick up the beeping on like radios and things like that. Sorry. So this was the first man-made satellite to orbit Earth. And for the most part, the Soviets had been trailing the United States in technological advances. And now, for the first time, they beat us at something. They launched something into space, and it scared us. So that's 1957. The Soviets beat us to something. A few months later, they launched Sputnik 2 into space, and they actually had a live dog in there that lived in space for a little bit. Of course, they couldn't get it back, so it dies. Poor thing. What did the United States do in response to Sputnik? Well, boy, we better really get going on this. And we decided to create NASA in 1958, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and start working on things. So we've got these fighter pilots that start training to become astronauts. We also figure we need our schools to be more focused on things like math, science, and foreign languages so that we can defeat the Soviets. And so there's a big push to start really ramping up the math and science classes in school and foreign language classes to learn a different language. We thought that was important. Kind of a good movie about the space race, October Sky, about a group of kids in school that design a rocket that they can launch into space. And this kind of starts off the arms race and the space race, which is decades long. The United States and the Soviet Union to see who could create better weapons and get farther into space and utilize outer space more. And so this happens for years and years and years, and to some extent is still going on. But it was basically the U.S. competing against the Soviet Union and vice versa. If we created something, the Soviets had to create something better. If the Soviets created something, we had to create something better, and it went back and forth. Eisenhower went on TV in 1957 and announced that the United States had launched an X-17 rocket into space capable of carrying a warhead, nuclear warhead. So that was big news. You can see this would be not an actual nuclear warhead or warhead, but replica of one, the size of one that could blow stuff up. And Eisenhower's on national TV looking at it. Basically, this is a message, not just to the Soviet Union that we have it, but to the American people. He's sending a message saying, look, yeah, they have a satellite up there. We can launch this up into space, and it can come back down and hit targets. So we can launch it a long ways. These intercontinental ballistic missiles that can travel across continents. Pretty big deal. In 1961, the Russians or the Soviets are able to launch a man into space. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to end up in space, and they do bring him back, so he doesn't have the same fate as that dog. But he was launched into space, flew into orbit, circled the Earth, and then he was able to come back as the satellite came back to Earth, landed in the ocean. So Yuri Gagarin, first man in space. They did not call them astronauts, they called them cosmonauts. Then, a few months later, the United States, still trailing Russia, launches the first American in space, Alan Shepard. And he also orbits the Earth. Talking a little bit more about the arms race, I mentioned the hydrogen bomb earlier. It was developed by the US, tested in 1952. You think about the destruction that the bombs in Japan had. The hydrogen bomb, the H bomb, was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. 1,000 times more destructive. And the Soviets, 10 years later, I believe it was the most powerful bomb ever tested, called Tsar Bomba, 1961. And you look at the graph here, some of the bombs the United States were testing, the hydrogen bombs. You have the Mike bomb and the Bravo bomb right here. And here's Tsar Bomba that was tested by the Soviets, much larger than these two. And then you look at the comparison of Hiroshima down here, tiny compared to these bombs. So now, yeah, when we're talking about the United States and Soviet Union each creating several thousand bombs, nuclear missiles, that are way more powerful than the only ones ever used on people, yeah, we can destroy the world. We have enough nuclear bombs to destroy most living things on the planet. And so that is scary to think about. And people were worried about this stuff back then. So here's the intercontinental ballistic missile, which was a big invention, a missile that could travel thousands of miles and deliver a nuclear warhead. This is kind of what we're worried about North Korea getting right now. We know North Korea has nuclear bombs. They just simply can't make the bomb small enough yet and put it onto a missile that can actually carry it. That's what they're. So when you hear about, oh, North Korea tested another missile that landed in the ocean, they're trying to create a missile, the technology that can carry that bomb. So we've had this technology, and the Soviet Union and other countries have had this technology since the 1950s, 1960s. North Korea is trying to catch up to that. But yeah, this was scary because you can shoot a plane down carrying a bomb. It's going to be tough to stop a missile. They call this nuclear proliferation. If you hear that in a debate on TV or something, nuclear proliferation. As our nuclear stockpiles proliferate and grow, and in the thousands, we actually have less nuclear weapons today in 2020 than we did back then. But you can see by the 1960s, it's over 20,000. Where were we testing these bombs? In the Pacific Islands, out, far from lots of people. In some of the islands, we had to remove people. Over 500 were removed from the islands, and they still haven't returned. So you think about, okay, because the islands aren't safe. They're still radioactive. Well, who's been paying for this stuff? These people, U.S. taxpayers. A lot of these people still get a check, or their kids or grandkids are still getting a check in the mail. This is kind of, you can see the different places where the bombs were being tested. Where the United States test a lot of our bombs, right here, Bikini Atoll, Eniwetok Atoll, Christmas Island, Johnson Island. So these Pacific islands way out here in the middle of nowhere. Soviets were doing most of their testing way up here in the Arctic. You can see France doing some out here in the Pacific. The United Kingdom doing some smaller tests over here in Australia in the Pacific. Bikini, you saw the word here. Well, bikini became famous in the 40s and 50s during the testing. The guy who actually invented bikini named it after Bikini Atoll, where the testing was. He named the swimsuit Bikini. Here's the inventor of the bikini. So then he wanted the swimsuit to be revolutionary, like the bombs, that are explosive like the bombs. And then, of course, we've got SpongeBob, Bikini Bottom, which is at the bottom of Bikini Atoll. Maybe all the radiations would turn all these things alive. I don't really know. The guy who took over when Stalin died was Nikita Khrushchev. And he actually took a trip to the United States in 1959. This was a good way to kind of ease the tensions. And all of a sudden now you have one of the, our enemy coming to the United States on a trip to look at different things. Stalin probably never would have done anything like this. But it's, all of a sudden people are like, hey, you know what? Maybe we won't have a nuclear war. Maybe we won't destroy the world. And you can see Nikita Khrushchev here. He's at an Iowa farm. He took celebrities wanted to meet this guy as he traveled the country. And then all of a sudden, a year later, bad news. We had a spy plane that we thought was way too high to ever get shot down or anything. So we had been spying in these U-2 planes that flew really high. We thought they were off the radar. Turns out eventually they weren't. And our spy plane gets shot down over the Soviet Union. And our pilot was captured. Francis Gary Powers, May of 1960, the U-2 incident. U-2 spy plane shot down. Horrible for relations because we weren't supposed to be doing that. And all of a sudden, we kind of have egg on our face that we were spying on them. Of course, they had spies in the U.S. too, but we weren't supposed to be flying a plane over there. And we had said we weren't. That was probably the worst part. We said we weren't spying on them, and then we were. So we got egg on our face. Eventually, the U.S. negotiates for his return, but now they had our spy plane, they had our technology, and they're able to kind of create those spy planes. So basically, this kind of reverses all the good that had been done by Khrushchev's visit. Another scary thing that happens during Eisenhower's presidency is the country of Cuba, that we had basically, a lot of our business people had land in Cuba, and we had done a lot of business with Cuba since the Spanish-American War. Americans had sugar fields and stuff like that ever since we helped Cuba gain their freedom, kind of, from Spain. In 1959, a group of revolutionaries overthrows their government and turns it communist, and they nationalize everything. So a lot of businesses in the United States, a lot of people owned a lot of land in Cuba. And just like that, the government took it. So nobody owned land in Cuba except the Cuban government. The guy that was in charge of the revolution was Fidel Castro. And basically, all the land, all the businesses become owned by the Cuban government. The Soviet Union is going to support them. And this was the guy that was the dictator from the 50s all the way into the 2000s. So he was Cuban dictator from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, before he gets too old. So more of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Eisenhower gives a farewell address, and he warns America of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. So as he leaves office after 8 years, he says there's something you need to worry about. Kind of like George Washington gave a famous farewell address, and he warned Americans of political parties, which, of course, we did not heed because we've got two main political parties, and we've always kind of had two main political parties. They've had different names, but we've always had political parties, and they've always fought with each other. Well, Washington warned us about that. And then Eisenhower, he's going to warn us about the military-industrial complex, the MIC. And this deals with essentially businesses that make weapons and then give the money or sell the weapons to the government. And then the government might vote that, yep, we need more weapons. So in his speech, he said, in the Council of Government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. So the relationship between a nation's military, economy, and politics. Dangerous to invest too much into the military and not enough into other areas. Here's kind of how it works. You have large military corporations that make weapons. Think of a Minnesota company that started off making air conditioning units and things like that, heating units, Honeywell. Honeywell during World War II gets involved in making weapons and stuff like that. They still make weapons. They still are working on these things, and a lot of companies do. Well, they make campaign contributions to Congress, both sides, Republicans, Democrats. And then, of course, once the people are elected, they get into Congress, and they say, yep, we need a large military, and we need these companies that are making the weapons, we need to keep stockpiling them to be safe. So Congress, both sides, vote, to do this, and these companies get these big, all this tax money's paid to them, and they keep making weapons, and then they sell it to the Department of Defense, and they have these big contracts, and then the large military corporations get richer, and they keep selling or keep giving money to politicians. They keep voting to keep funding the defense, and it's a never-ending cycle. And this is going on as we speak, and it was something that Eisenhower worried about. He's a military man, and he worried about this stuff. All right, so that's the Eisenhower years with the Cold War. And next time we will discuss the Kennedy years.